be presenting this work with Seshadri at University of Wisconsin-Madison. I guess I don't have to explain much of the background. It's kind of evident by the session I'm placed in. And one thing that I do want to emphasize, though, is that our paper is not really about the early childhood per se. It's more about the intergenerational persistence, and in particular about the intergenerational persistence of earnings. Okay? And no one has really mentioned this today, but this is quite high. I think traditionally people believe this to be approximately a number of 0.4, but this is based on very short time horizons. And a more recent study that look at longer time horizons find that this can be as high as above 0.6. Okay? And this is something that we want to focus on in this paper. Okay, on the other hand, there's also a lot of empirical studies trying to disentangle like what matters for this level of persistence. Is it just natural endowments that you can't really do anything about, or is it something that we can actually affect using policy tools? Okay, and I'm not going to really go into the details, but there's been a lot of studies about this, especially in the public literature. Okay? And what we want to do basically is we're going to take a very macro approach. We're going to build a very stylized macro model, a quantitative macro model, and see like how much we can account for like these kind of empirical facts. And specifically, what kind of stuff are we trying to account for? Well, I'm going to broadly kind of divide these into like micro and macro related kind of facts. So basically, on the micro side, what we want to do is kind of defend the Becker-Tolmes paradigm. So a lot of papers that study intergenerational persistence, they kind of take this seminal paper by Becker and Tolmes. It's a very simple two-period OLG model. But they don't really address like a long-standing empirical criticism that people have been making against this model, starting from Goldberger back in the mid-'80s and more recently by Mulligan and others. And basically the point is that as long as you assume that human capital returns are concave, or that you have decreasing returns to scale in human capital investments, then whenever you see like an old parent who's leaving some physical investments, it means that the parent was able to invest optimally in the child. So therefore, that guy will have optimally invested in the child, and the guy who's constrained, who does not leave any bequest, was not able to invest optimally. Okay. So then, what you should see in the data is that the constrained families should display much more stronger persistence of these kind of statistics. And basically, what Goldberg and Mulligan kind of found out, especially Mulligan in a series of papers, was that this doesn't just seem to hold in the data. When you look at constrained versus unconstrained families, the degree of intergenerational persistence seems to be more or less the same. Okay? And of course, we've seen some papers today about the early childhood, the mechanisms of early childhood investments for like human capital formation. So, I mean, like I said, this is not really a paper about early childhood investment, but our story is going to be kind of similar. What we're going to do basically is take the Becker-Tolmes model and just build in a very simple life cycle component. So like these early childhood papers are saying, it seems that probably the timing that the borrowing constraints are important is when the kid is a kid and the parent is kind of young, not when the parent is really old and just leaving bequests for the child. Okay, so basically what we're going to say in our life cycle model is that the point that the child investments matter is early in the life cycle and the parent is still young. By the time you're old, you probably made all of your human capital related investments. Okay, so that's why you're going to see that. And we'll show you quantitatively that we can generate that once you're old and look at the constrained versus unconstrained families, that the intergenerational persistence will look kind of the same. Okay, on the macro side, what we're trying to do is we're kind of building on this traditional quantitative macro literature about inequality. Right? So starting from the earlier papers by Ayagari and Huggett and others, and many people in the audience, I guess, when they were trying to explain inequality, usually what a lot of people have done is take some kind of exogenous earnings process and then try to generate some degree of wealth inequality, in particular in the US, because the degree of inequality is so large compared to what you see in earnings data. Right? So by looking at an intergenerational model and also with a life cycle component, we want to ask whether we can kind of account a little bit for both earnings and wealth inequality endogenously. But of course, we're not the first ones to talk about earnings in an endogenous way. There's a lot of papers, especially that take human capital models and try to generate this kind of endogenous level of earnings inequality. And again, people in the audience have papers about this, and they kind of emphasize that initial conditions are important. In those kind of papers, the initial conditions are kind of already when you're a young adult. In particular, this paper by Huggett and Yaron is when the initial condition is starting from when you're age 23. Right, so what we want to kind of say is, well, if we add an intergenerational component to a very stylized life cycle model, can it kind of account for these initial conditions? Okay. So I don't want to go too much into details of what we do because I'll go into the model anyway, but basically the key component that we're adding to a standard a plain vanilla Baker-Thomas model is a very stylized life cycle component. And this is just going to be one additional, or depending on how you view it, two additional points in your life cycle compared to the two-period OLG Becker and Thomas model. Right? And of course, we're not the very first to kind of think about linking a life cycle and intergenerational model. But our innovation is kind of that we're going to make the parent continue to accumulate in its own human capital according to this Venn-Perath human capital production function. Okay? So the key of our paper is that when the parent is a young adult and deciding to make investments into the child, he also has to simultaneously decide how much to invest in himself. Okay? So, and in our model, the story is kind of, well, I'm a young adult, I want to invest something in my child. I mean, if I like my child, which they will in our model, I just want to try to achieve as much as possible the optimal level of human capital investment. But at the same time, I'm trying to do this for myself, right? So there's going to be a trade-off between my own and child human capital investments. Okay? And
why that feature?
I'm sorry?
Why that feature? I mean, what are you capturing from the world that has?
So that feature will, is in particular, help us account for this empirical puzzle that we.
What do you look at in the world that you think is giving you that trade-off between?
So kind of in the real world, what we're kind of thinking about is like, well, I don't really have any children, so I'm probably not the best person to talk about this, but when you're like in your mid-20s or late 20s, and people are still like in school or grad school or maybe, and these people have a lot of children, right? And traditionally then you're going to have and at least a lot of my friends say that when I think about going to work or working on my thesis or whatever, I still have to spend time with my child, and there's this kind of a conflict.
Okay, so it's going to be a time.
We're not explicitly modeling as time. We are trying to model as a time in a revision. In this version, it's going to be both time and goods. Right, and then just kind of going back to the macro side, our model we're just going to calibrate the benchmark model, including a lot of policy instruments. So there's going to be progressive taxation, a Social Security element, and some subsidies. I don't think I'll have time to talk about all of these. One thing I will try to talk about a little bit today is just the progressive taxation one, because this is potentially interesting and has different implications compared to previous results. Right? And of course, I said all this because we use the model, and we are able to account for a lot of the things that I said we're going after. In particular, what's going to be important in our model is that this simultaneous decision of making human capital decisions in myself and for my kid will also, and this is important, but in addition to that, what's also going to be important is the way that we model parental spillovers, which I'll show you when I show you the equations that are related to the model. And so again, we're not really modeling early childhood per se, but this kind of parental spillovers is kind of the way that we're kind of capturing what we think is early childhood intervention in a reduced form way. Okay? And since I talked about progressive taxations, just to give you the result, if I don't get there,
what's your theory of a woman?
I'm sorry?
What's your theory of a woman?
A woman? No, they're asexual. Yeah.
No.
So.
Are they sexual or they don't exist?
Sexes.
No, I'm saying, do women exist?
What do you mean by women? I mean, you mean men? Do men exist?
I think you use the data.
Okay, well, I don't know. Then ask him about the data.
Oh, okay. So.
I mean, but how do you see men and women?
Well, it's kind of similar, I guess, to the first paper today. We're not really it's just a single parent, single child, right?
How do you think of looking at the world?
Well, what I think about matching the world, so what I'm matching for the intergenerational persistence of earnings, this is kind of a family characteristic. So there's data about fathers, sons, all the children, based on both the parental incomes.
So what happens to the temporal for the secondary earnings? So how do you use the W word?
So I'm not saying that, I know this is, of course, very important, but we're not going to have this in the model. So when we look at, some moments it's going to be just based on like some aggregate moments we take from NLSY, and most of the moments we're going to just be based on men.
So women don't exist.
Yeah, well, I guess
I thought you were talking about the theory.
Right. Yeah.
So because they don't exist.
In the model, they don't exist. Yeah.
Well, since you're talking about people who have to, spend time in education, you would have
Right.
thought a lot of those would have been high school mothers, dropouts, pregnant women.
Sure,
something.
yeah.
I'm just not sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I thought you were going in that direction.
No, so I'll admit that if you really go into the micro details, this is probably not the most relevant model you want to look at, right? So what we wanted to do is kind of capture more of this kind of more micro studies in a reduced form way and see what kind of macroeconomic effects we can get.
So, but you're concentrating a lot at the bottom end of the distribution, right? Welfare recipients, people who are more constrained. I mean, what happened at the top of the distribution? Do you care about that part?
The very top of, like the very wealthy people. No, this is not. This model will not really be able to address like the top 1 percentile or things like this. Right, so just to give you one result up front, just to talk about progressive taxes, I think so. There's a few papers out there that talk about like human capital accumulation and how progressive taxes might be good for human capital accumulation because it kind of, let me rephrase. Progressive taxes might be good for reducing inequality by potentially reducing the incentive for the very able parents to invest too much in their kids. In our model, this is not going to happen, and this is, again, precisely because you're making two choices about investing in yourself and your child. Right? So although by having more progressive taxation, you're going to maybe potentially take away some investment for your kid, right? What you would have done if you didn't have the additional component of having to invest in yourself would have just led to some more physical bequests, and that would have consequently led to more earnings equality. But in this model, what you'd have done is just invested in yourself. Right? But then in our model, if you invest in yourself, that's also going to be hit with this higher tax rate under progressive taxation. So what we find in the quantitative results is that when we just flatten out the taxes without progressive taxes, there's almost no significant quantitative effect. Okay? Right, so let me just now I'll just jump straight into the model. It's going to be a very stylized 4-period OLG model. Right, so the young parent is going to be 20, and we're just going to assume that the generations overlap in this very stylized way. So the parent will be 20 to 40, and the kid will be 0 to 20, and it just repeats over and over again. Right? And so there's going to be what we call early childhood environment here. I actually want to mean like between 0 and 6. I couldn't fit it in this small interval. Right? So this is something that we're not going to be able to capture in this current version of our model. Right? And then we're just, and the most investments that we make is going to be schooling. So this is like a 14-year interval. So it's going to potentially capture some of college, and some of college is going to be your own decisions after you become independent. Okay. And technically, I guess this should be called interview transfers. We're just going to call it requests for the sake of presentation. And when I try to calibrate the model, we're going to just target this to match aggregate intergenerational transfers, not just bequests that you give at the end of the lifetime. Okay? So the parent goes through his life cycle. When he's 20 to 40, he has to care about not only educating his kid, his own human capital accumulation decisions. He gets old, still earning money, and he's saving up for his retirement and receives also Social Security benefits.
So
Okay?
what do you say does not represent the upper tail? I didn't get why that's not the case.
Well, I'm not saying the model like inherently is not representing the upper tail. So we looked at some, I'm not going to present it today, but we looked at some wealth-related statistics. Right? So it does generate a lot more skewedness toward the top compared to earnings equality, but it's nowhere near like what you would see in the U.S. data. Right? Like it's not like the top percentile is holding 33% wealth. I think it's maybe like 25 or less. Yeah.
If we think about this trade-off that's being faced here, it really is a matter of time for the parent, isn't it? Because the parent is in the stage, it's no longer deciding whether to pay fees for grad school, but
Right.
really more about
Yeah.
how they should stay to work.
So I think, so conceptually, I guess, so I've talked with a lot of people since we print this version, and I guess it's time, and I guess that my disadvantage is I don't really have a kid, so I don't know. And in an update of this model, we're trying to transform it to be explicitly more about time. But I think one thing about time, which was also mentioned in the first presentation, I guess, is that the data about that is very hard to interpret.
But I think
Right, so.
the issue is the price, right? Is that these people,
Right.
because they're older, the price of human capital investment is going up as well as
Right.
the wage.
Yeah.
And so this may weaken the trade-off that people are facing in your model. It's really that trade-off that makes the result work. And the trade-off is going to be weaker if you raise the price of investing in human capital.
So if I made it, sorry, go
So
ahead.
I'm just wondering if the way you formulated it sort of reflects in some way sort of this increase in, I guess, opportunity costs.
So the way we formulate it right now is that the parent is actually not inputting any time directly to the kid's human capital production. It's just the kid's time, right? And as a household, potentially you could have made the kid work, right, and for some kind of equilibrium wage, right, at a very low human capital level. Okay? But I mean, in the way that we calibrate it is going to be such that the kid doesn't do any work at all when he's a kid. Okay, so this NK that we're going to...
So the reason poor kids turn out poor is because the parent's too busy investing in their own human capital.
For some kids, yeah. I mean, not all, but kind of in aggregate, yeah.
Right, but these poor parents, that their costs, they're still paying a higher cost now because they have, for investing in human capital.
If they wanted to, yeah.
So you say that the rate of return for poor people is...
Well, for adults, I'm just thinking more for adults in general, and it happens to be more important for poor people.
So therefore, poor people, the rate of return on investment
So,
themselves is higher.
actually-
for that.
Why don't you let him go?
Actually, let me actually just address what you're saying. So you're kind of saying that the problem is that the high human capital parent is going to have a higher cost of investing time in the child, right? This is kind of what you're pointing out if I explicitly model time. So if I just had that element, yes, this model wouldn't work. So I haven't done a serious quantitative version for just, simple simulation. It won't work, and that's kind of why we have to include like this spillover parameter here. Okay, so if I just go over this equation very quickly, so this first line is just a standard Ben-Perez human capital accumulation function, right? So A is going to be the ability of the adult, and this is going to be the ability of the kid. Right? N is going to be time investments, again for the adult and the kid, and these are going to be the human capital levels of the adult at age 20 and the kid at age 6, so to speak. Okay, let me talk a little bit more in detail about that.
Just ask a question, maybe you want to do it later or others. You've made a comment, somebody else has made a comment that time use data is hard to interpret. The American Time Use Survey
Right.
has extremely explicit questions about spending time with kids, health, their
Right.
education, their data, the very, very, very detailed
Right.
stuff. What's hard to interpret?
Well, because then you also want to somehow get the substitutability and the complementarity between like what is really the time input and the good input. Right? And I think that the harder thing is how to exactly formulate a human capital formation function for the kid using a time and goods inputs.
Right, we would like to know
Yeah.
the consumption budget, the expenditure budgets of the households in great detail as well as
Yeah.
the time data.
Right.
We've got gobs and gobs and gobs of time data on different dimensions. So I'm just
Right, so-
curious, is it because people don't
Well-
model time, they just say the data's messy, or is it really, I don't know why it's regarded as messy.
No, so I think that there is some empirical evidence that the richer parents spend more time with their kids. Right? You can get this kind of inconclusive evidence, I guess, and well, I mean here we're not really capturing this. And the other thing is, again, this is not really a paper about early childhood, right? So this is more about when the kid is going to school. And this one, I don't really know. Like, what can I say about how much time is the kid spending at school, putting in effort or doing homework and this kind of stuff. Right. So just going back to the human capital formation inputs, the N is going to be the time, and the M is going to be like the consumption good inputs. Okay, and each of them is going to have a return of a gamma 1 and a gamma 2. Okay. This D here that we have only for the kid is just going to be the educational subsidies that we model. So this total MK plus D is going to be subject to this goods return of gamma 2. Right, so the biggest difference that the parent has from the child is the spillover component that we have here. So this H is going to be the human capital level of the parent of this kid. Okay, and the reason that we kind of have to include this is because we're not talking really about early childhood formation at all. We just kind of put this in there to capture in a reduced form way to capture this effect, right? And that is going to have a return of gamma 3. So if this gamma 3 is calibrated to be 0, then it's basically going to say there's no effect at all. Unfortunately, it's not 0 when we calibrate it, so there will be some kind of heterogeneous returns of the parent's human capital level in affecting the investment of the human capital of the child. Okay, so kind of going back to John's questions about the time input, so even if my time is very costly because I'm a very high, rich parent, right? As long as this gamma 3 is not 0, it means that just by being a high human capital parent, it's investing in my child will have higher returns than a low human capital parent. So this will kind of trade off against probably the higher time cost of the parent.
Assuming the returns gamma 1 and gamma 2 are same for
Yes.
adults, and how important
Right.
is that?
So for this current version of the model, it is important. And so, like I said, we're working on revision, right? So this is kind of where we got hammered on, like why should the adult and child human capital accumulation formation be the same? So we could kind of separately calibrate this, right? And then the calibration method will be different. What's really more important is having some kind of spillover effect, right? Okay, we just have to have some additional input affecting the child's human capital formation that doesn't exist for the adult. Okay? Right, and then kind of, is this very similar to other papers? We're just going to assume that there's some exogenous evolving ability process, which is just a log AR1. Okay? And if you just look at this, then it's kind of obvious that, well, this rho is going to be part of the intergenerational persistence. There's also going to be these human capital investments, and in particular for the way that we're specifying the function, this gamma 3 will be very important in explaining intergenerational persistence. So the key parameters are going to be these 4 things when we try to calibrate it. Okay? And I won't go into details about the policies since I don't think I'll have time to talk about them.
Wait.
Sorry.
So earnings is just a function of your human capital? Your labor market earnings?
Your earnings and your time. So you have to also choose how much time to invest in human capital accumulation or work.
Wait. So but n plus nk is equals to 1? Where's your hours of work? But there's no hours.
No, I haven't showed you the optimization problem yet.
Oh, so you will?
I will,
Okay,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah. Right, all I want to say here is that I'm going to just say FE is your after government policy blah, blah, blah earnings. Okay, so just for notation in the next slide. Okay, so this is going to be the problem of the old adult. So now this guy is old. Okay, in next period he's going to retire. Since we're not modeling any uncertainty at the last period, this is just going to be a 2-period income savings problem basically. Okay, so and this problem is not so much. It's not as interesting as a young parent's problem. The next slide. So what you're going to do is you're just going to come over with a cash budget that you decide when you're a young adult, and you're going to decide your consumption, your savings for the next period, and how much to leave for your parent, right? I'm sorry, for your child. And this we're going to call bequests. Okay, and then your retirement consumption will just be determined by your savings choice and what you get out of your Social Security payments. Okay? So what's really important here, is it's not really this. What's important here is this intergenerational borrowing constraint, right? So in the same way other people have done, it's just that you cannot borrow against your children you cannot borrow against your children's future earnings to invest in themselves or to finance my own retirement savings. Okay? And this is kind of very in the spirit of the original Becker and Thomas framework, right? So this is basically what the whole argument about whether the Becker-Thomas model is relevant kind of focused around. Okay? So the most interesting part of the model is going to be the young adults problem. Okay, so I'll just go over this a little bit more slowly since this is important. So the states of the young parent is going to be the child's ability, my own ability. Okay? We're going to have some additional heterogeneity aside from the ability. So there's going to be a luck shock, a market luck shock that hits you when you start working or you're eligible for working. Okay? And this is your current human capital level, which was determined by your own parent when you were a kid that you bring into your young adult stage. And this is the level of bequests that was determined again from your parent. Okay? So this guy is going to maximize on some continuation utility. So this is just a kind of adult equivalent scale. Right? So C is going to be divided by this adult equivalent scale because I also have a little kid that I have to feed. Right? Plus the old adult's value function that you saw on the previous slide. Right? So the decisions I'm making is going to be my consumption choice. I have to invest some goods in the kid. I have to save for tomorrow. Right? I'm going to earn some stuff that's going to be EY. F is just going to be the government policy function. Right? And so this is also something that we're changing right now. But in this version of the model, we're assuming that the kid could potentially work and also generate earnings for the household. And again, like I said, we're going to calibrate it so that this is going to be basically 0. Right? But you know, all we kind of need to have is some kind of a conflict between the kid sacrificing some time to accumulate human capital or not, right? So it could be maybe a utility parameter or something else as well. Okay? So this is going to be some potential benefit you can get from the kid's time plus your parents' bequest. Okay? And I just take over to tomorrow because I make a human capital investment decision in myself. Right? What I'm going to earn as an old adult will depend on my decision today. So that's going to be E of O. And it's again going to be hit by this government policies and plus my savings. Okay? And my earnings when I'm young is just going to be the wage rate times my human capital level, the luck shock, and how much time I spend not accumulating human capital. Okay, so this is the time that I spend working, and also minus the amount of time that that I'm investing into human capital accumulation. Right? So the reason that we're doing this is we could have potentially this be 0, or we could add another parameter here. So this is usually in the literature that does this, kind of says like how much is the employer paying for human capital accumulation on the job, but here we're just kind of saying it's 1. Okay.
So the educational policy makes the slope of the wages different.
Yes.
So it's going to document that somehow, that some we have seen there.
So this is one of the moments that we're going to try to match the slope of the earnings profile.
Is there any variation in the world that tell us that that's the case?
That there's
That people face a higher subsidy for schooling.
no. So we're not going to.
Their wages are steeper.
So there is some evidence about the profile of earnings. So especially if you account for very poor households who sometimes earn like 0, like when they have young children. Right? So the profiles themselves could be steeper for the poor people. Right? So the levels are very low for the poor parents, but the profiles can be much steeper. On average, the profiles are not that different across.
I was thinking more across countries or states.
No.
See the role of subsidies to education.
This I'm not aware of. Right, and then again, kind of symmetric to the previous slide where you have intergenerational borrowing constraints. These guys, we're not going to assume that they're borrowing constrained at all. There's just going to be a natural life cycle borrowing constraint. So this is saying that over your lifetime, you cannot earn, you cannot borrow more than you're going to earn in the future. Okay? Because when you're a young adult, you already know exactly what you're going to earn over your lifetime, because by making a one-period human capital investment decision for my life cycle, I also know what I'm going to earn when I'm old. Okay? Right? And the firm is not interesting. It's just a standard homogeneous degree 1 function that's going to maximize profits. And I guess I should have pointed out that we're going to solve this model in a general equilibrium, so it's kind of computationally expensive. And the reason we wanted to do this is to kind of get the equilibrium effects of government policies. The definition of the equilibrium itself is not very interesting. But only thing I want to point out is that we do have government budget balance, in the sense that we have taxes. We're not reverting all the taxes into the model. The only transfers we have here are educational transfers and a welfare transfer, so it's like a consumption floor. If we're not going to assume that all the taxes go into this, we're only going to match like this fractions of the subsidies over the tax revenue, and the rest is just going to be thrown in the ocean. Okay? So I have a few slides talking about the details of the model. I just want to go over the first one. So like I said, I think there is a novelty in our model in that we have human capital accumulation for both the parent and the child, and also there's asset accumulation over the life cycle. Okay? And when we kind of run into like these, this is it looks maybe simple, but it's kind of computationally difficult. And kind of adding to the difficulty is this dynastic utility. So instead of saying it's just a wage income or consumption, we're just going to explicitly take the utility function. Okay? And since I have all these policies, I can see what those effects are, and the rest, I guess I won't have much time to talk about. So before I talk about the calibration, we have to put some more structure on the parametric form. So these two are standard. It's just the HD1 production function, CRA utility. And like I said, the abilities are going to just evolve according to a log AR1 process. And the log shocks we're going to assume are IID across dynasties. Okay. And since I want to talk a little bit about progressive taxations, I just want to note that for the current model, we're using a very standard Gouveia-Strauss average tax function. So when we try to flat out the taxes, basically we're just going to look at this parameter. We're just going to control like this parameter so that we match an average tax rate and forget about all the curvature that comes from tau E2 or tau E1. Okay. Right.
Bequest tax?
I'm sorry?
Bequests are taxed?
Yes, they are. So we don't have a separate estate or bequest tax or anything. There's just going to be a separate tax rate for capital assets. Yeah. So I guess I should have pointed that out. So it's this tax rate is only going to hit earnings income. It's not going to hit capital income. So capital income is just taxed flatly. Right? And this is probably another reason that we can't really capture like the very top of the distribution.
So some people who are concerned about reducing inequality might propose taxing these less. Would that be a policy you could address in your setup here?
We probably can't address it because I think what's going to happen is it's not going to do much. The way that if you wait for the results, I mean, maybe you've seen the results before, but you can kind of see that it's probably not going to do much. So these fixed parameters are pretty standard. I guess the only contentious one is like, why are we setting this h bar to 1? And this is something that we didn't really like either, and we're also trying to endogenize this in a revision, right? So explicitly, some combination of h bar and h to the gamma 3, the spillover component we had in the child human capital accumulation function, is going to be something that most people call early childhood intervention, right? So now we're trying to kind of endogenize this, borrowing more from what we learned from early childhood, from the early childhood literature. Okay? So these governance parameters, just to set the stage for this progressive tax experiment, right? So we're going to try to match an average earnings tax of 17.7%, right, coming from the earnings tax. The rest is going to come from capital income taxation. Okay? So the rest of the parameters I'm not going to have time to talk about, so I won't really mention. And then maybe for the quantitative people, this is the slide that you were waiting for. So basically, we're trying to calibrate these 8 parameters to match these 8 moments. Okay? So the annual interest rate is standard. So for the average years of schooling and the aggregate education expenditures, okay, so this is going to be some function of the time and goods inputs into human capital formation. So that's kind of how we set this gamma 1 and gamma 2. And this is not cross-country or anything, but we're trying to match an average life cycle profile of 120%. So this might kind of sound low, because probably you're a lot familiar to hearing like very steep earnings profile when you go from a young age to an old age adult. But remember that we're kind of aggregating over 20-year periods. So when we look at so I looked at the NLSY data and just kind of did a PDV of 20 years from 20 to 40, and then the 40 and beyond, and it turns out to be about 100%. Right? So this is what we're going to try to match with this moment of the model. Okay? And we're going to try to match the Gini of lifetime earnings. This is going to basically be thanks to the volatility coming from the epsilon shock and the ability shock. Right? How do we differentiate from the Gini of earnings and the Gini of wealth? Well, this epsilon shock is IID, while the eta shock is going to affect ability, which is a persistent shock. Right? So that's going to be more related to wealth moments. Okay? And like I said earlier, this bequest we're matching to intergenerational aggregate asset transfers over net worth. So this in the U.S., according to a paper by Gale and Schultz, is about 60%, and that's what we target. Right? And then, most importantly, we want to target the intergenerational elasticity of lifetime earnings. So this is basically the coefficient you get when you regress log children earning on log parent earnings, right? And this is the one that we say is somewhere from 0.4 to 0.6. In our calibration, we're actually going to try to match 0.5. And this all.
Can you go back?
Sure.
So you
here.
assume the rho, which is the ability correlation, is already 0.6.
No, we don't assume this.
No.
Yeah.
That's what the model
Yeah,
says.
yeah.
So all other mechanisms is lowering this rather than increasing?
Yes.
So
I mean, it's not one-to-one, but in general, yes.
so you don't have this idea of, ability and investment are kind of that complementary, and there is, you start from some initial ability differences and it kind of diverges. That doesn't happen in your models. There is more kind of a convergence.
There's a regression to a mean.
There's a regression to the mean kind of model.
Yeah,
Other thing is that, this gamma 1 and gamma 2, where do you identify those from? I mean, from the children's side or from the parents' side? You can identify from the
Sure.
both sides.
Yeah, so mainly this is going to come from the children's side. Right? And then the gamma 3, which is maybe kind of paradoxical, we're going to get from the parent side.
As a residual,
Yeah.
something from
Yeah,
the parent.
yeah. And
Can
this
you
is
quickly remind what is gamma 1, gamma 2, gamma 3?
so gamma 1 is the returns to time investments, gamma 2 is to good investments, and gamma 3 was the spillover parameter I had for the parents' human capital level in the transfer.
The mu is the constant of the growth of ability? No?
Yes, this is just the average
Getting
means ability.
smarter every
I'm sorry?
iteration?
No, this is just a mean. It's there's a regression to a mean, so this is just a mean of the abilities. Okay. So actually,
Growth.
sorry?
The mean of the growth.
No. It's not a growth parameter. It's just the mean level of abilities. Okay. All right. Right. So I don't want to. So I don't really have time to get into details. So a feature of the way that we set up the model, right? So there will be like a permanent effect of any kind of human capital investment, not just because not coming from the exogenous transmission of abilities, but also just through this gamma 3 parameter, right? Because if I have a high human capital parent, right, it's gonna, and if I invest in the kid's human capital, right, that higher level of the kid's human capital is gonna persist throughout the generations. Okay, this is one feature of the model that a lot of other models don't have, and I just want to talk a little bit about how we get the gamma 3. It's kind of basically what Desi was asking. So gamma 1 and gamma 2 we're getting from like the child's human capital formation. Gamma 3 we're getting basically from the difference between the intensity of education in the child and how much your earning profile grows from being a young adult to an old adult, right? Because basically the intuition is that if gamma 3 is very high, education is much more important than own human capital investment, so that you should see a lot more education and a flat earnings profile like this. And when gamma 3 is low, it should be the other way around. Sorry.
Again, in the data, highly educated people have a much steeper earnings profile than low educated.
No, actually, if you look at the average, it's not that different. Because there's a lot of very low earnings parents.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
For the low earnings is very flat, and for educated is in the data. Does the opposite happen in the model? Because we don't understand.
No, in the data, so what I'm saying is that I think conditional on having positive earnings, then it's the poor parents are very flat and the high educated parents are very steep. But if you don't condition on having a positive earnings, it's actually not that different if you just take look at an average. Because in this model,
Does that mean not to condition, like throw them away, they don't exist, they don't count? What do you mean?
Put
Yes.
everybody together, the zero earnings and the positive earnings.
So those people don't exist, what they have zero earnings or?
no, they do exist.
Just saying that if you take the average, you put in the zero, then it's different?
Yes. Well, just because it's very close to zero, right? These zero earners.
And you get a big steep slope because the initial level is very low because of the zeros.
So these other people have zero earnings between 20 and 40?
I'm sorry?
Lots of people have zero earnings between 20 and 40?
Well, so not 20 and 40, but so like sometime in between, like say 20 to your mid 30s or early 30s in the data.
Some people have zero earnings and they're low
Right.
educated.
Especially so those that there's a lot of people also at the welfare level, right? So they're not even, they're just subsisting on welfare receipts. Right? Yes. But the other thing is that, like I said from the beginning, it's not the model you want to take like really deep down to the micro level and try to explain all the heterogeneity.
I'm trying to get the key implications. One
Uh-huh.
of them was that in societies where you give more subsidies, there will be cheaper wages because parents have to waste less time earning for them or something like that. That was one. The other one is what's the relative steepness of educated versus uneducated. That's what the role of the gamma 3 is. Just
Mhm.
the choices that you make about what the technology has clean implications that I just wanted to see.
So first of all, we're not doing any cross-country studies about this, and I'm not an expert on what the cross-country numbers look like about this.
We're going to do changes in policy though, and then we're going to have sharp predictions about how people respond to them, so we want to have that right.
Well, presumably, if I really want to do a cross-country comparison, I would maybe.
Across country, no, you're doing across policy.
Right.
This is different.
Mhm.
So if you increase the subsidy to school, then parents are going to reallocate their
Right.
investment. They're going to change law.
Can I? So if I have so I wasn't going to do this, but so I do have one slide about the education policy specifically. Can you maybe wait until then, right? So I'll try to cover that part instead. Okay. So basically, this is just how we identify the gamma 3 by the difference in the intensities of education and how steep the aggregate earnings profile is. It's not across the population, just in the model aggregate. So for the average. Okay. So this is just to show that it fits pretty well, and what I can kind of I don't have here, but basically we we use like 5 grids for the earnings process, and I guess a lot of you will know that if I increase the number of grids, I can get a better match, but it just becomes kind of more computationally costly, and it's just too costly to do all of the other experiments I'm doing. So we settled down for the few number of grids, which have this kind of a match, which I think is reasonably good. Okay. And we also have some evidence that this, at least for in aggregate, this is a kind of a reasonable model. It matches like moments from consumption, schooling, wealth, and other things pretty well as well. I'm not going to be able to talk about this in this presentation. Okay. So one thing that I talked about in the beginning was about like this implication of the Beckert-Holmes model. It seems that the Beckert-Holmes model in itself, when you look at a 2-period OLG model, doesn't really is not able to say anything about the data at all, because when you look at the constrained versus unconstrained families, the level of persistence seems to be more or less the same, right? And this is kind of pointed out in this nice paper by Mulligan. Okay, but more recently, there's this paper in Riestadt by Mazumdar who said that, well, he kind of did a similar experiment, but slightly different. Mazumdar explicitly looked at those old parents who are leaving bequests or not. Mazumdar looked at kind of younger age parents who are poor or not. Okay? And then he just differentiated between poor or rich families. It's not really a notion of being constrained or not. Right? And see whether like there's different levels of persistence across like these poor and rich families in the data set that he used. It's basically the SIP plus some other data sets. Okay? And in his study, there is a very big difference in the intergeneration persistence of earnings. Okay? So they have seemingly conflicting views, but basically the thing is that our intuition is going to be that, well, Mulligan was looking at old guys and Mazumdar was kind of looking at young guys. Okay? So what we have in our model is that we can kind of account for both. So this was not targeted, so we're not trying to like hit those numbers by Mulligan or Mazumdar. But basically, when we look at the guys who are for the old parents who are bequest constrained or not, I mean, this difference is not so large compared to when we look at the young parents who are poor or not. Okay, so we just kind of do the same division that Mulligan and Mazumdar did. Right, so look at constrained versus unconstrained, and poor versus rich at the young age. Right, so you can see that in our model. Right, so the difference between this constrained and unconstrained is, I mean, there's still a difference, but it's not that high. Whereas if you look at the guys who are poor or not, there's almost like it's almost a double the difference. Okay, and the reason that we can get this is basically because we have this this countervailing forces of investing in myself and the kid, and also this spillover parameter. So we struggled a little bit about how to actually show this in terms of the mechanism of our model. So what we did is basically construct this indicator, what I'm going to call education intensity. So this is just how much you would invest in your kid if there was no constraints at all, right? And so this is trying to get rid of the heterogeneity we have in the model, right? So regardless of your A or epsilon or whatever, if you had no constraints, this is what you would invest in without the constraints. This number should be, with our calibrated parameters, 1.061. Okay? So what happens here is that, you know, if you look at the guys, so again, these are the old parents, constrained or not, in terms of bequests. They're pretty similar, right? So it is true that those old parents who were constrained when they were young also had pretty low savings. So they were borrowing against their future. Right? So they were borrowing against their future basically to also invest in themselves. They're investing some in their children, but both of these numbers are not very different from the guys who were able to leave bequests for the kids. So basically what's happening is that, you know, by the time that the kids grew up and I'm old, I already tried my best to invest in my kids. So there's no reason that I have to additionally leave any bequests, because I sacrifice a lot of my young income to my kids, and now I'm old, I want to save for myself, for my own retirement. So this is very different from the guys, when you look at the guys who are young and old, and just look at and split them by the level of their savings, right? So then you see a pretty big difference in the education intensity parameters. The guys who are constrained educate them less. The guys who are not constrained educate their kids a little bit more. And kind of surprisingly, what's happening here is that the guys who don't really educate their kids are investing more in themselves, as you can kind of see in the earnings profile, right? And the guys who are not investing in their the guys who are relatively investing in their kids a little bit more are investing less in themselves, right? So this is kind of the story that we want to tell, where if you look at an old parent who doesn't leave bequests, it doesn't mean that he was not able to achieve some optimal level of education. It's just that by the time he was old, any human capital related investments are probably already made. And since I'm almost running out of time, I just want to go to this one. Instead of the progressive taxation, I'll maybe talk about this poverty persistence exercise we did. Right? So what we wanted to do with this exercise was, because we had So I didn't present it, but we had welfare transfers in our model. So there was basically a consumption floor where if my level of income falls below a certain level, then the government is just going to match it up so that I'm guaranteed a certain level of income. Okay, and then the reason that this is important is that if you look at the public literature that tries to answer these questions, is that, well, do you want to actually? So when I think about subsidizing these poor families and try to help them educate their kids, is it really good? So are they actually strained in the sense that they didn't have the resources to educate their kids, or was it that they actually, with the small level of subsidies that they're getting, they're actually able to achieve, conditional on the child's ability, an optimal level of human capital investment, so that by giving them too much, you're just kind of wasting this money. Right? So we have this. So this T of Z is just basically whether or not you receive these transfers. Okay. So there's a study by this Gottschalk, I think it's in 1996. Right. And this is not targeted at all again. Right. So we're just looking at the guys who receive welfare or not. Right. Okay.
What
And
is
so,
this and no in that table?
and so these guys are the guys who receive transfers. So okay, sorry. Let me try this again. Right? So these are the guys who receive transfers. So these are the parents who receive transfers, yes or no, and whether the kids also receive transfers when they grow up to be an adult. Okay? So this is a persistence of kind of a poverty level. So it's like a persistence of welfare recipient status. Right? So if I receive welfare as a young adult, then
What are the chances that I receive welfare in the future, my kid and I, or how?
Yeah, so this is just so this number is just an empirical study. It's just the raw data. They just look at a sample of mothers on welfare recipient status, right? And they track their daughters to see if they grow up to also get welfare recipient status. So if you did, your daughter, about half of your daughters also did when they grew up. Okay? And if you didn't, then about 22% did. Okay, so what I'm trying to show here is that this is just kind of by luck. Somehow our model is kind of similar to these numbers when we just track what happens to welfare recipient status across generations. And the important thing is that for these guys who do receive welfare and where it persists, the education intensity parameter is pretty high, right, compared to the guys who don't. So this basically means that the subsidy levels that the poor guys are receiving is more than optimal. Right? So this is even higher than what. So I'm normalizing by EI star, right? So this, if I'm investing exactly at the optimal level, this should be 1, but this guy is even higher than 1. So there's a lot, right? And I look at how much the subsidy is same for everyone in our model, and xk is where heterogeneity might come in. I just look at this fraction. So the government subsidy is making up for about 93% of what I wanted to do anyway to begin with. Okay, so I'm done, and we have other implications that I won't be able to talk about. So basically, in conclusion, we just wanted to build a model that can count for some empirical irregularities that the original Becker-Tomes model couldn't account for, and also build in some policies so that we could see whether including an intergenerational component can have more interesting effects that other models didn't. Yes?
Can you summarize, you're saying that giving money to poor people doesn't do any good in terms of increasing human capital of their kids?
No, it does, right? But it's beyond the optimal level. Yeah, yeah.
Right. So, can you tell us the source of identification of particularly that thing? Which piece of the data conveys to your model that finding? If I wanted to tell somebody how you find it,
Yeah.
how is it that you found that the world is like that?
I think the thing is that a lot of it must have to come from the gamma 3 parameter, right? Because there's these parental spillover effects, right? So if I'm like a crappy household, anything that would have been a crappy household in a plain vanilla model is going to be aggravated even more here, because I'm affected even more by my parents' level of human capital.
Is that because the only way of educating your kid is by giving up earnings later?
Yes.
The relative slopes of educated and uneducated tells you that
Rel-
no other margin under which the money matters little and because the parents are not giving up a lot of their earnings when old. It means that their own investments are small. It just
So,
the rich guys get it for free, and then the rich guys cannot do much. It's not worth it. Is that what you, the
So-
choices that you made that carry
so both things are going on, and in the end, the numbers we show are kind of an average of both effects. Right? And I also have to admit that, I mean, this is where we're trying to do more work on, like, trying to get more, like, whether this fits the micro-level evidence, and also accounting for maybe enriching the model a little bit to make it more consistent with these kind of questions you have, maybe. But the way it is, it's really not fitting.